Hello, my name is Carolyne Larrington and I'm an Emeritus Professor in Medieval European Literature here at the University of Oxford. During my career, I taught Old English, Middle English and the English language, but my main research interests have always been in Old Icelandic literature, mythology, folklore, women's writing and the history of emotion in literature. Since I retired, I've been working on various projects, and one of them is a series for the British Library called The Little Books of, and what the books are about are various folklore creatures. My first book in this series was The Little Book of Trolls, but the most recent one to be published is The Little Book of Dragons, and that's what we're talking about today. My favourite dragon has always been the dragon in Beowulf. It's a slightly unusual dragon, but it's one that's been very influential in that it's the kind of ancestor of the great dragons of 20th and 21st century fantasy. The dragon in Beowulf is a fire-breathing dragon and it flies through the air. And it has the propensity, as Germanic dragons do, to be attracted by hoards of treasure. So this dragon has been lying peacefully on a hoard of treasure for 300 years without bothering anybody. And then somebody breaks into the cave and steals a single golden cup from the hoard while the dragon's sleeping. When the dragon wakes up, it realizes that it's been robbed. It goes on the rampage. It burns down Beowulf's hall. It flies through the sky, raining down fire on the people below. And it's suddenly converted into a menace which has got to be destroyed. And so Beowulf and some of his followers go off to kill the dragon. And of course, killing a fire-breathing, poison-spewing dragon is no easy task. Beowulf is successful with the help of his young kinsman Wiglaf, but he dies in the attempt. And Beowulf has a splendid funeral. The poor old dragon is tipped over a cliff into the sea. And I always feel a little bit of sympathy for this dragon, because if you leave them alone, this kind of dragon, they don't do anybody any harm. And the Beowulf poet sees this dragon as a thing of beauty and talks about how no longer it would go playing through the night sky. And you suddenly get a sense of the dragon just flying with its fiery breath and its great wings for fun, just exulting in being. And so that was always my favourite dragon. I don't think that's changed particularly, but one dragon I did like very much from the book is the dragon of Mordeford, who starts out as a very small dragon, only the size of a cucumber, the tale says. And a little girl called Maud finds it in the woods near Mordeford and starts feeding it milk. And her parents wisely tell her to leave the creature alone. But of course, the dragon grows bigger and bigger, and soon milk will not do. And the dragon begins to eat people, eat cattle, wreaking economic damage, and it has to be dealt with. So it's not so much the bigger dragon there who behaves like a lot of folktale dragons, but it's this rather cute little cucumber-sized green one, which I now am rather fond of. I think that's a question which is really difficult to answer. And the kind of most obvious answer, I suppose, is that snakes are near universal across the world, and people fear snakes. And so the idea of something which is like a snake but bigger, and not something that slides away and hides, but something which is very dangerous, is maybe something that's rooted in the universal psyche. But what's very interesting, of course, is the way that the Western dragon is a great menace in its various forms. But the Eastern dragon, the dragons of China, Korea and Japan, are also capable of being fierce. If they're made angry, they'll bring rain, they'll bring floods. but otherwise are fairly benign creatures. They're very much associated with rivers. They're a kind of manifestation of river gods. And people can coexist with these dragons. The dragon is a symbol of the Chinese emperor, for example. And in some other world myths too, we find that the serpent is there at the beginning, not as in Christian mythology or Old Testament mythology as a symbol of the tempter, but as a kind of generative force, something that's creative. We get this in Latin America, Mesoamerica, and in many Australian story systems as well. Again, that's something with no easy answer. I think because the serpent is so early identified in the West with a kind of wisdom that belongs to creatures who live below the earth. It's not the wisdom of birds or the wisdom of animals or humans, but it's a kind of hidden wisdom. And from as early as the book of Genesis, the serpent then becomes identified with evil. And that we also find in neighbouring ancient Near Eastern cultures too, that something which is a bit more like a sea monster, so a more watery kind of dragon, becomes an enemy of the gods and has to be overcome in some ways, like Tiamat in Sumerian tradition, or Leviathan, who plays in the sea and sounds very much like a kind of whale, but a frightening whale in the Old Testament. And so I think it's that very early identification with evil that shapes the dragon and the sea monster, the watery sea monster, so much in the West. Whereas in Eastern cultures, I think perhaps there's an identification between the actual form of the river, its long, sinuous shape as it winds through the countryside, and the dragon who, in some ways, when it takes off into the sky, because Oriental dragons don't have wings, looks almost like a river that's flying through the sky with its whiskers like a fish and its horns and its big eyes. There's something about the way that the dragon and the river are kind of symbols of each other that takes it out of a kind of sense that dragons are intrinsically good or intrinsically evil. They're powerful, just like rivers are. We need rivers to live, but we want the river to stay in its place and not flood the places where humans live. I think there's a difference between dragons as a strange animal, like a lion or a bear or a tiger or something like that, which is, if you meet it, it's very, very dangerous and it will try and eat you. And that kind of creature, the kind we find in medieval bestiaries, for example, or the bestiaries of antiquity, is just an amazing natural thing. And the fact that you've never seen one and I've never seen one, but I've never met a tiger in the wild either. So in that kind of system of thinking, the lion and the tiger and the dragon are as likely as one another. And the dragon has strange habits. It can't bear elephants, for example. It likes to attack elephants whenever it has the chance. So there's that kind of dragon. And then, and I think this does have to do with, first of all, Jewish Old Testament tradition, and then particularly with Christianity. The dragon as the sign of the devil imbues it with real moral evil. And that varies quite a lot from story to story, from locality to locality, because if the dragon, like the Beowulf dragon, is left alone, it can be perfectly harmless. But most often the dragon starts impinging on human habitats, and then it's got to be dealt with. It seems to come from the earliest law that we have about animals, from Pliny, I think. And so it's from well before the birth of Christ. And it just seems to be, I suspect, the idea that there's a hugely powerful creature imagined in the world, this dragon. What could oppose it? Another hugely powerful creature. And if we think of the elephant as the biggest thing, the biggest land mammal, that could be the thing that can fight against the dragon, though in the bestiaries the dragons generally seem to win. I think dragons have gone through different stages, at least in the West, in popularity. So the great flying fire-breathing dragon that we find in Beowulf, and we find a couple of instances of that in Old Norse literature, makes way, or is kind of sidelined, let's say, for the standard creeping dragon who doesn't fly anywhere. He lives in a hole, in a lair, sometimes with treasure, sometimes without treasure. And he comes out at night and he eats people, cows, virgins, whatever. And that kind of creeping dragon as something that a local hero will then go and deal with. And then the dragon is carved in the church and becomes part of local folklore. Then gets sidelined again through Tolkien to some extent, but also through Richard Wagner and his Ring Cycle, because the figure of Fafnir, the most famous dragon in Old Norse literature, is one that then feeds back into 20th century thinking. And the thing about Fafnir is, because he's a greedy, treasure-loving individual, he was something else that changed into a dragon. He can talk. And I think one of the most interesting things is that apart from Fafnir in antiquity, dragons usually don't talk. The dragon of Wantley is an exception, but he's a kind of comedy dragon, and so his capacity to speak is part of the joke in a way. But Tolkien and Wagner, Tolkien following Wagner, but also following Beowulf to some extent, pick up on the idea of this monstrous, huge, gold-loving creature. And Tolkien fuses together the idea of the flying dragon and the talking dragon, and makes this extraordinarily potent idea of Smaug out of it. And so I think it's the dragon speaks to different kinds of fears at different times, but it always embodies something that's terrifying, but also wonderful at the same time. You can't not admire a dragon, even as it's spewing out its poisonous breath or flying through the sky. I suppose one of the more surprising things was how early the dragon becomes allegorical, and how, which is in a sense already in the Bible, in the book of Revelation. The dragon appears in the end times and is very minutely described. And so that dragon then feeds into the sense of dragons as being evil, as opposed to just being strange but dangerous natural creatures. And so it did surprise me that that dragon should be quite so influential in terms of how it functions in allegory, and how that then gives you the idea that dragons, these Germanic dragons who love treasure, are symbolic of greed and that kind of human failing. But actually the folkloric dragons, the creeping dragons, usually don't have a gold hoard, and so they just sit around sitting in their cave and then come out and eat things. And so it was a little bit surprising for me to find out how few dragons actually live on a gold hoard. We associate them with gold and treasure now as much as anything, I think, because of the influence of Tolkien. But in the previous centuries to Wagner and Tolkien, that association between dragons and treasure had more or less died out, I think. There are just a couple of folk tales that make reference to them. Dragons, I think, are so central to modern fantasy storytelling because they are so powerful. And in some senses, the dragons of Game of Thrones, for example, whose ancestors lie in part in Smaug, but a non-talking version of Smaug, they speak, I think, and this is what Tolkien was thinking about to some extent, to the terror of absolute aerial warfare, what it's like suddenly, as we found in the 20th century, to have a weapon that can rain down absolute destruction from the sky. And it can happen in the present day, whereas in the past, the idea of something flying overhead and setting fire to your hall was a kind of fantasy. Fires would burn down halls anytime, but usually not produced by a kind of mystery figure in the sky, but because your enemy had come and set fire to your hall. But I think there's something about the terror of these huge creatures the size of modern bombers or even bigger being able to do that. So I think that's the fire dragon's role. The other kind of dragon, the one that's just a bit of a local pest, the more folkloric creeping dragon, is in some ways, I think, a more interesting figure because there's a debate about, in fantasy literature, how do you annihilate the dragon? Or do you even want to? Could you not learn from the dragon? And this is where the talking dragon's return has become really crucial, I think. If we look at Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea series, for example, those dragons are unapproachable. They're not friendly dragons who are desperate to tell you things. You have to know how to treat them. You have to respect them. You have to speak the old tongue to communicate with them. But they've lived such a long time, they know things that humans don't know. And that sense of another kind of creature in our world that has a very different view of life because it lived so long, because it's seen so many things, and it can communicate to you, unlike whales or the Greenland shark, for example, that lives 400 years, or unlike birds who can imitate human speech, but they can't communicate with it. And I think there's something about another being with another kind of sentience that is really interesting about the modern fantasy dragon. The explanations of why people think there's such a thing as dragons, I think are kind of unsatisfactory. That people say, well, it must be that in the past people dug up fossil finds of dinosaurs and thought, oh, that's very big. It must have been a creature. Let's call it a dragon. But that to me sounds like, in some ways, putting the chicken before the egg. I suspect that, and as far as we can tell, there isn't any particular correlation between fossil finds and predominance of dragon stories. And then the most popular explanation at the moment, I think, is that the snakes are so universally regarded as dangerous that the dragon is just kind of big snake invented to frighten people, to tell them to stay away from snakes. But again, that seems to me insufficient as an explanation. Yes, that might be part of it, but I don't think it's quite enough. So I don't know why the dragon is so universally similar across the globe, even if it has different habits, different moral connotations. I think people did in the medieval period kind of half believe in dragons, in the same way that we might believe in the Yeti or Bigfoot or something like that, or the Loch Ness Monster. That, as I said earlier, I've never seen a dragon, you've never seen a dragon, but in the medieval period, you might know someone who knows someone whose uncle saw one time when he was in the woods, and he disturbed something and it moved, and it was probably a dragon, so he ran away. So I think there was that kind of belief on a sort of local level, at the same time as we had this learned belief that dragons certainly exist, just not in this country. They're out there somewhere in Africa or in the Middle East or in the Far East doing dragony things, but you could go and study them. And everybody knew about dragons. And various kinds of substances would be imported into Europe and called dragon's blood, and then you could make medicine with it and sell it, so when it's probably something else entirely. So yeah, I think there was a real belief in dragons up until probably the early modern period, at which point dragons became so allegorical and so much the stuff of romance or the stuff of Christian teaching that if you are greedy, you'll become like a dragon, that they began to lose their substantial place in people's imaginations. I think dragons have become increasingly useful to think with. I think that's probably what it is. And I think that has something to do with the dragon's power of absolute annihilation, particularly the flying, fiery kind of dragon. But similarly, the creeping dragon that spews poison, particularly poisons water sources, for example. Both of them become symbolic of forces that make the human habitation unlivable. And we're beginning to get a sense that that is possible, that we can destroy it. There can be something in our habitat that is so destructive that we can't live alongside it. So I think that's the modern reason for the dragon becoming so important in contemporary thinking. Over the centuries, though, I think it's just really a matter of the biggest, most dangerous foe that you can think of, and what it tells you about human courage and human ingenuity, that a hero can overcome it. Because quite often in the dragon stories, it's not simply a question of riding up to the dragon, sticking a spear in it, or sticking a sword into its more vulnerable parts. As we know, dragons are well armoured, so you have to know the right place to stick your weapon. But in a number of more recent folk tales, it's thinking about how to turn the dragon's qualities against itself. You make some kind of device that you can stick down the dragon's throat and make it explode, or you put some pitch around a prey animal, a calf or something, and then the dragon will come along and eat it, and then the dragon will explode again. So there's a kind of thinking about scientific, ingenious solutions to the dragon, as well as just the kind of brute force of sticking some weapon into it. And I think that's another reason why the dragon has been so kind of culturally significant. I think it's probably from about 3000 BC in Sumerian myth, if we see Tiamat, who is a sea monster, as a dragon, or as a kind of dragon. And the question as to whether these watery dragons are really dragons because of the association of fire with some kinds of dragons. Clearly, if you're a fiery dragon living in the sea, isn't a great idea. But if you're a poison-spitting dragon, then the sea is perfectly okay as a place to be. So I think Tiamat is a kind of dragon. But after that, I suspect the earliest dragons, at least in the West, are the ones that we find in various Greek myths. So we have the Hydra with its multiple heads, and every time you cut off one, more heads grow from the stem. Or you have Typhon, who's also a dragon, who's overcome by Zeus very early in mythic time, in Greek mythology. So you certainly have from about, at least from about the 1500, before the Common Era, you have those kinds of stories in the West. And quite possibly the Chinese idea of the dragon is at least as early. Well, the Little Book of Dragons is something that I was asked to write by my editor at the British Library. And these books are really inspired by the fact that the British Library has endless manuscripts, printed books, holdings with wonderful illustrations. And although after the cyber attack, the library had a great deal of difficulty locating the different illustrations they wanted for this book, they finally managed to locate them all. And so the point of the book was really to introduce the various images, but actually also to give an overview about dragons from the very first mentions that we have of them, both in the West and in the East, and to talk about the different roles they have, the different kinds of creature that fall under the heading of dragons, and to tell some of the most enduring stories about them.